Hello there, this is James the Scrofty, 1978, and watching the old videos that made up Men's Media Movie Month, or on the Folding Ideas channel, links down at the underbar, it's occurred to me that I should underline a point which, as usual, I believe is so blindingly obvious that no one should ever actually have to state it directly, but ironically enough, needs to be spelled out directly precisely because it is so obvious. In this case, the realization that we as men resent and seek to control women and thus feel threatened by feminism, the state, and what have you, because we are deeply insecure about losing, or in many cases, never gaining control over our own lives, and therefore over the lives of others. Or to put it even more simply, that it isn't women, feminism, or the state, that anti-feminists and others resent, fear, and even despise, but themselves for not being quote-unquote masculine enough to overcome these perceived threats to their egos. After all, the entire fantasy ideal of masculinity as portrayed in fiction such as the James Bond movies and the film 300 is that as straight, white, cisgendered men in particular, but not exclusively, we own, control, dominate, and overcome. That we have power over our own lives and destiny, and that such confidence, in inverted commas, is the key to having power over external events and the lives of others, and incidentally, to getting laid. That whether it's a female M telling us that we're obsolete relics of the Cold War, or a foreign, specifically brown and queer invader seeking to erase us and our city-state from history, our antagonists seek to belittle, diminish and strip us of that power and control, but in the end, we show them who's boss and thus make women swoon and willingly devote themselves to our manliness. But then, in direct contrast to this impossible fantasy ideal, what is the quote-unquote reality of masculinity as portrayed by pretty much every other work of fiction which features a male protagonist, particularly those whose overwhelmingly straight, white and cis male creators failed to understand that Homer Simpson was a satire and thus sought to make us all feel better by showing us that even the stupidest, most incompetent and most comically unattractive man in the world of television can still be relatively successful and have a devoted and much more conventionally attractive wife and family, especially when it's played for laughs.
What is a man in a movie? Angry, defensive, bad at communication, helpless, ignorant, incompetent, better off when he listens to his own instincts, prey to larger predators?
Get out of there, little fella.
Little fella! Total control.
Men are so insecure.
It's boys that are happening to these girls.
We're also saddling Janet with a built-in family. You really think that's fair?
You teasing little bitch.
I've got 5 boys. Thank God.
This depiction of men as helpless slaves of their base desires still operating off of caveman logic? Yeah, that's all part of male gaze. And you know what? That's an almost terrifying amount of inward aggression and self-loathing.
Seeking not necessarily to control women, but to have control over their own lives, and expecting that when they do, then women will naturally bow to their masculine superiority. Here in the real world as well, from the self-serving hypocrisy of demanding the right, in inverted commas, to financial abortions, and to never be forced to pay child maintenance when we don't want to be burdened with the responsibility of our own children, but then demanding to be able to veto a woman's right to have an abortion when we insist that we should be able to burden them, to effectively demanding that no woman should ever be able to accuse any man of rape without irrefutable, concrete evidence, simply so that we can feel free to seduce women in inverted commas without fear of being quote-unquote falsely accused. Anti-feminists and others are obsessed with what they perceive as their own lack of power and control over their own lives, insisting that their rights are being violated simply because other people, usually women's rights, trump their inconvenience, and thus projecting their resentment, fear, and even hatred onto feminism, the state, and women in general for taking agency away from all men. And as Foley himself points out, in fact, This fear that women and the state are taking away our manhood is an intrinsic aspect of the male gaze in fiction, which after all is the male gaze precisely because the fiction in question is overwhelmingly created by straight white cis men, specifically with other straight white cis men in mind as the target audience. An aspect of the male gaze which, as Foldy himself points out, is often overlooked because we usually focus on the equally serious, if not more serious, issues of male gaze with regards to women and non-white individuals. However, the reality is that even to this very day, fiction far too often objectifies women, portraying them as prizes to be won, with the fact that the hero gets to have sex and or a relationship at the end not being an end in itself, but simply evidence of him now being in control of his own life and having overcome all obstacles. And on the other end of that spectrum as well, that when men in fiction fail or are unable to achieve their goals, it's always the world at large, women or simply bad luck which are to blame, never the character's own belligerent incompetence, bitterness, resentment, laziness, lack of talent or qualifications, gluttony or stupidity, because such character flaws never have any lasting, genuine consequences for sympathetic male characters in fiction at least. It all simply demonstrates that as men, we are so focused on ourselves and building up and maintaining our own fragile masculinity that women are essentially incidental, merely something that society in general and fiction in particular tells us that we'll earn or win as soon as we are manly enough. And so when we're stuck in dead-end, usually minimum wage jobs or unable to get a job at all and or simply can't get a girlfriend, too many of us blame hypergamy, feminism and women in general, socialism, political correctness, the state or whatever else to compensate for our sense of inadequacy, since our egos, which have been artificially inflated since the moment we were born by the portrayal of masculinity in fiction, won't allow us to consider the possibility that it's our fault that we might not be manly enough, or even more blasphemously, that being manly on its own won't help us to achieve anything anymore, simply because the world has now changed. And then as a result of the vicious cycle of fiction creating shallow archetypes to which the target demographic then relates, creating a demand for that kind of shallow, one-dimensional everyman character with which all men and boys can supposedly identify, we end up with tropes such as the mediocre dude saves the world, and characters in the loosest possible sense of the term, such as Peter Griffin and Sam Witwicky, who, while not being real in any meaningful sense because they are such gross parodies of manhood, are each the personification and reinforcement of everything that is wrong with us as men and patriarchal society as a whole, particularly how it constantly, although implicitly, reassures us that being a man by itself is enough, that as men, we naturally deserve everything, and that if we don't have or receive it all the time, then it's always someone else's fault.
This right here is who we think we are because it's a version of who we are, but that just makes us more like Sam because he makes it okay to feel as insecure as we feel or to resent women because somewhere in our brains we kind of do, even if it's not something that we act on, and it's okay to want to kick things that bug us, and it's okay to feel like you deserve the world because your friends are super awesome robots, and even if you've done nothing, you're still so important to the world that everyone will tell you how special you are and you'll always be vindicated. It's not your fault that you can't get a job. It's not your fault that your girlfriend is constantly angry with you. It's not your fault that everything goes wrong. Sam Witwicky is the meta male. He is the heart of darkness. He is the oblivious admission of our own deepest fears and perversions. He is both stunningly real and insultingly false. He is horrible because we are horrible. Stare into his eyes and face the horror.
And to conclude this video by spelling out the point in big print and lots of pictures, because having discovered this meme while searching for images that I could use in this video, its very existence demonstrates once again that all criticisms of feminism are either straw men or the result of the fact that their concrete little minds demand that everything is either or, and so any crossover must therefore be a hypocritical self-contradiction. Rather than masculinity being one or the other, it becomes toxic and dangerous because it is fragile. As a direct result of the fact that we are so terrified of not measuring up to the masculine ideal or norm, and as a result being ridiculed, dismissed, or condemned as being inadequate, cowardly, weak, or otherwise a sissy little girl, that we blame everyone else, turn to everyman characters like Scott Witwicky and Scott Pilgrim for comfort, and would literally rather kill each other in fights to prove our manliness, kill women because they might laugh at us or refuse to fuck us, and kill ourselves to avoid the humiliation of admitting that we're not real men. Why else do you think that the suicide rate among men is so terrifyingly high, you morons?